a very good morning, and thank you so much for this introduction, General De Silva. My name is Viviana De Annuntiis, and I work for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I am based in the regional office for Asia and the Pacific that is located in Bangkok, in Thailand. And I would like, of course, to thank the Sri Lanka Army, the Sri Lanka Ministry of Defense for inviting the United Nations and OCHA to this defense seminar 2015 and address this panel that we look at no military threats to global security. I think this is a very important and timely debate to have. And as you can see, the focus of my presentation will be on natural disaster and climate changes. There is no doubt that the number of people affected by humanitarian crises has almost doubled over the last decade. And as a related effect, the cost of humanitarian assistance has risen threefold. The global challenges that I'm going to discuss with you, such as natural disasters, climate change, rapid and unplanned urbanizations, are all contributing to an increasing vulnerability to shock and stresses. So it is very clear for the United Nations that there is a need for increased focus and attention in helping countries and communities to better withstand, adapt, and quickly respond to recover when shock and stresses occur. Therefore, more and more, we as the international community are placing great importance and investment in building resilience that will help to ensure the lives and livelihoods are not destroyed in an instant, that the risk and scale of humanitarian crises are reduced, and that development gains are safeguarded. So the focus of my presentation today will be on three different aspects. The first aspect will be to provide an overview of natural disaster and climate change challenges that affect especially our region, the Asia-Pacific region. The second part of the presentation will look at an outline of what global consultations we are actually conducted as part of the United Nations when we talk about Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, or DRR. And the third part will briefly outline the role of my organization, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the international community in emergency preparedness and response. So looking at the first part of the presentation, there is no doubt that the Asia-Pacific region is one of the most highly vulnerable regions to natural disaster. It actually accounts for nearly 45% of all the world's natural disasters and accounts for 82% of the world disaster victims. If we just look at 2014, where we had 226 natural disasters, over half of these natural disasters occurred in the Asia-Pacific region. So this region accounts for 11 of the top 20 countries in the world ranked by exposure to natural disaster. And this is a ranking system that my organization, OCHA, adopts from a ranking system that is called INFORM. So when we look at the Asia-Pacific region, very often it's not so much if we will have another large-scale natural disaster, but when this is going to happen. If we look at the, let's say, past decade or so, starting in 2004, the extent of the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami that claimed the lives of 230,000 people, destroyed entire villages, and wiped out people's livelihood and decimated infrastructure. From there, we also had another other big large-scale disaster in 2008, Cyclone Nargis, who affected Myanmar. 2009, two devastating typhoons in the Philippines. The Great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. In 2013, the large-scale typhoon Haiyan that again affected the Philippines. If we look at just 2014, although 2014 was a year without a single large-scale earthquake or tsunami, the region experienced severe storms, cross-border floods and landslides, which accounted, as I mentioned, for 85% of all the world's disasters. So only in 2014, 79.6 million people were affected by natural disaster across the region. As was mentioned in the introduction by General De Silva, of course, this region is also among the most vulnerable to climate change. And as we know, climate change is affecting the frequency, the intensity, and the geographical distribution of natural hazards. So the effects of climate change are being felt on sea levels, the ecosystem, water availability, agricultural production, and are increasing the risk of food insecurity and threatening the livelihoods of the most vulnerable people. The social consequences of climate change are also important, since this brings people to being displaced or migrants because of the natural disasters that are occurring within their region or within their communities. My organization is placing a lot of attention in this region on El Niño conditions. As you know, El Niño can affect the weather in large parts of the world, depending strongly on the location and the season. Usually in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region, El Niño results in a lower rainfall amount across the Southeast and South Asia, leading to much drier than normal conditions. And we all know the consequences of having drought conditions, which can lead to food insecurity, job insecurity, and affecting the livelihoods of many people that are living in Southeast Asia and in South Asia. So more and more my organization is advocating with governments and humanitarian partners to closely monitor this El Niño condition in this region, consulting with national meteorological and hydrological services, and also forecasters from the World Meteorological Organization. The most important thing is that we support national governments and humanitarian partners to be prepared and to have ready and available capacities to respond to these El Niño conditions. And at the same time, I think Asia and the Pacific has made considerable progress in strengthening national disaster preparedness and response capacity. National countries in this region are in the leading role of emergency preparedness and response and disaster risk reduction, and the regional and the international actors only provide support when the scale of the disaster exceeds national capacities, and when national authorities either welcome, accept, or seek international support. There is also in this region an increasing appetite or desire for regional organizations such as SARC for South Asia or ASEAN for Southeast Asia to play a stronger role in disaster management and response, the idea of neighbors helping neighbors. Many countries in this region have in place a suitable legal framework for disaster management and a regulatory framework that actually indicates to international organizations how best to plug in into national systems to provide support when needed. At the same time, in spite of this progress, we need to be better at having, let's say, global frameworks that actually look at building resilience of nations and communities. And you are, I'm sure, very well aware of one of the landmark framework, that is the Yoga Framework for Action, that was implemented for the period from 2005 and 2015. That is actually the strategic blueprint to guide national and international efforts to reduce vulnerability and risks by natural hazards and human and man-made processes. As you know, the Yoga Framework of Actions is due to end this year, in 2015, and consultations and negotiations have already started in 2012 to develop a second Yoga Framework for Action. In addition to that, the United Nations is very committed to the post-2015 development agenda and to the implementation of sustainable development goals. We are involved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and last but not least, the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. The Secretary General decided that it was time for us as humanitarian community to come together in a World Humanitarian Summit to actually set a forward-looking agenda for the way that we conduct humanitarian assistance and humanitarian action. We want to ensure that the humanitarian system can meet growing and more complex needs with ever more limited resources. So the first World Humanitarian Summit will be convened in May 2016 in Istanbul, in Turkey, where there will be 4 main themes that will be discussed as part of the summit. The first theme will be looking at humanitarian effectiveness and how we can be better in delivering humanitarian assistance in context of conflict or natural disaster. The second theme, reducing vulnerability and managing risks, where some of the themes we are discussing today, such as climate change, urbanization, and natural disaster, will be addressed. The third theme will be transformation through innovation, and the fourth theme, serving the needs of people in conflict. Of course, the civil-military dimension of these themes will be very relevant for the humanitarian effectiveness and serving the needs of people in conflict. To prepare for the World Humanitarian Summit, a series of regional consultations are taking place. We had the regional consultation for North and Southeast Asia in July 2014, and just in August 2015, we had the regional consultation for South and Central Asia, where of course we had the important contribution of the Sri Lankan delegation. What we need to achieve, what is one of the challenges when we look at this global framework, the Yoga Framework for Action, the World Humanitarian Summit, we need to ensure that there is a trait d'union, a coherence between this global guidance framework, and that as much as possible, the overall humanitarian community, the humanitarian side and the development side work together to maximize their efforts in the implementation of this global framework. Looking at the third part of the presentation, the role of my organization, OCHA, in emergency preparedness and response. Just to give you an idea, we were created in 1998 as part of the United Nations Secretariat, and we are headed by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Stephen O'Brien. So our responsibility is to create an overall framework for emergency preparedness and response in which each of the humanitarian actors can plug in and contribute to make sure that we act in a coherent and effective way when we respond to natural disasters or conflict. So one of our main responsibility is to coordinate with national government and support them to respond to disaster when the large-scale nature of this disaster exceeds the capacity of national governments. Over the years, we have tried as much as possible to improve the way that we were implementing our mandate. As you know, there were important landmark events, especially in this region, that actually led the humanitarian system to conduct a review or an assessment on the way we were delivering humanitarian assistance. You can see here a brief evolution of the humanitarian coordination system, where some of these landmark events are marked. 2005, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, there was an extensive humanitarian reform and a humanitarian review to actually take into account the lessons learned and the recommendation of our response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. And as a result, the humanitarian reform was introduced and the cluster system was adopted by the international community. Again, in 2011, following the Pakistan floods of 2010 and also some other lessons learned like the Haiti earthquake, we again had to think about the way we were responding to natural disaster and whether we were effective enough. And therefore we embarked on another reform that we call the transformative agenda. They wanted to revolutionize or transform the way we were conducting humanitarian assistance. As a result, we have introduced stronger leadership in the humanitarian community with stronger resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator, a more effective coordination system, and increased accountability to the affected population. And as I already mentioned, the last, let's say, important event in this evolution will be the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, where we really want to convene the leaders in humanitarian development sector to look at the way we conduct humanitarian assistance, to look at the humanitarian principles, and actually see whether we are still relevant and effective to address the modern challenges. In fact, when we look at the international humanitarian architecture, we very often ask ourselves if we are ready, if we are fit for purpose to face the 21st century challenges. And very often we had to realize that the nature of these challenges require the humanitarian system to open up and involve other stakeholders or other actors, and maybe non-traditional, that can support humanitarian action. So as part of this evolution of humanitarian coordination, we started first and foremost to look at military actors and capabilities. Especially in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region, military actors are very often the first responders, especially in natural disaster. So there is no doubt the militaries have unique capabilities and assets they can deploy quickly in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, and they can support humanitarian partners to kickstart response operation as more longer-term humanitarian assistance is being implemented together with the national authorities. So in this region, a lot of dialogue, a lot of partnership has been implemented with military and police actors to actually see how we can work better and more effectively together to address challenges related to natural disaster, not only in the response phase, but also in the preparedness phase. So more and more we want to come together with military and police actors to look at our planning processes from the military point of view and from the humanitarian point of view, and we want to coordinate these planning processes so that we will have already an understanding in the preparedness phase of how we are going to work effectively together when we meet as part of a disaster response operation. In this region, this dialogue is very advanced to the point that, as you can see in the slide, we have developed regional guidelines for the use of foreign military assets in the Asia-Pacific region. This publication is called APC Madro Guidelines for Asia and the Pacific, and they were developed as a result of a 5-year series of conferences between 2005 and 2010. And these APC Madro guidelines are based on the more global guidelines on the use of foreign military assets called the Oslo Guidelines, but they reflect the reality of civil-military coordination in the Asia-Pacific region and how the dialogue interaction between civilian, military, and police actors is conducted in this region. So we are really, really positive about the developments we are having in the civil-military coordination in Asia and the Pacific. Another important actors that we want to involve as humanitarian community to face the 21st century challenges is the private sector. So more and more we want to involve firms and businesses, not only when we meet with them in the response, but again in the preparedness phase of large-scale natural disaster. And the way that we want to involve the private sector is at 3 different levels. The first level is what we call relationship preparedness. We want to establish partnership hubs at national and international level and broker partnership between the public and the private sector. The second level is what we call procedural preparedness, and we want to develop and promote more inclusive planning processes that actually bring in the comparative advantage that the private sector can contribute into government-led contingency planning. And the third level of interaction or partnership with the private sector is operational preparedness. We want to identify what are the key immediate needs that are likely to result following a large-scale natural disaster, and we want to provide guidance and technical specifications to businesses and private sectors on how they can contribute to covering these gaps or these key immediate needs. So this concludes my presentation, where I have outlined three different aspects. To begin with, I started with an overview, an outline of natural disaster and climate change challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. Secondly, I have briefly discussed the global frameworks and how we are going to update these frameworks on disaster risk reduction. And the third part was more related to the role of my organization, OCHA, and the international community when discussing emergency preparedness and response. So this concludes my presentation. I believe we will have a question and answer session at the end of the panel.
At the end.
At the end of the panel. Thank you.